Okay, so you probably ought to take some notes on this. We're going to talk about what we have covered in this unit. It was all about decimals. The whole unit was decimals, and it probably feels like we've been on it forever, but we are finally at the end. Okay, I'll check back in a minute. So the first thing that we covered was place value. And if you'll remember, those of you that joined us here recently, you don't have this. There's a place value chart. But once you get your Blackboard account, you can go in and you can get it. I'm going to try to remember to put it in today's folder so that you can have it again. But the place values, I won't do all of them. The chart had all of them, but this was the ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, then all of the decimal places after the decimal point end in TH or THS. So this was the tenths place. This is the hundredths place. And this is the thousandths place. And of course it goes on. The chart had much more numbers on it. But you've got to remember, first of all, that if the decimal place ends in TH or THS, those are the numbers after the decimal point. And you've got to know the names of the decimal, the place values, because they're not going to give you a chart on the GED. All right, so that was the first thing we covered. Then we moved from that into rounding. And the key to rounding are these 4 steps. First, find the target place value, whatever they're telling you to round to. Then we look next door. That's what we called it, looking to the right. Okay, so we look at the number immediately to the right, next door. And then if 5 or more, raise the score. So if that number to the right is a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, then your target place value number goes up by 1. And then 4 or less, let it rest. If it's 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, we don't bump up the target value. So for example, if I have 235.768 and it tells me to round to the nearest hundredth, round to nearest hundredth, ends in TH. So step 1, target value, hundredth. That is this decimal place right here. Second decimal place after the decimal point to the right. Find the target. Then look next door. If that number is 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, the target number bumps up. So this becomes a 7. Anything in front stays the way it was. And we drop. If it's after the decimal point, we drop everything after. If we had that same number, 235.768, and we wanted to round to nearest 10, the nearest 10, we find the target. 10. It does not end in THS, so that is not a number after the decimal point. It's a number in front of the decimal point. This is the tens place. You've got to know those place values. That's our target. Look next door. 5 or more, raise the score. So that 3 has to become a 4. The numbers in front stay the same, and then we have to backfill any numbers behind it until we get to the decimal place with zeros, and then everything else drops. We can't just drop the 5 because then it would look like we're writing 24, and 24 is not rounded to the nearest 100, nearest 10. So there's got to be the last number that should be a digit more than 1 should be whatever the target is. In this case, the target was the tens place. Okay, so we did a whole lesson on rounding. Then we did comparing. Okay, so after we talked about rounding, we did our third lesson on fractions was about comparing fractions or decimals. And we had numbers like 14.3 and 14.9, and we had to determine which number was bigger. And so this is a 1 in the ones place. It matches here. 4 on the ones place. It's the tens place. 4 in the ones. 4 in the ones here. So both of those are whole number part 14. So we've got to look at the decimal. And 9 is bigger than 3. So 14.9 is bigger than 14.3. And also understanding, one of you had a question earlier today about 2.04 and 2.40. Those are not the same number. This has a 0 in the tenths. This has a 4 in the tenths. So 2.4 is bigger than 2.04. Then we also did pairing fractions like 3/4 and 2/5. And we wanted to know which was bigger. And we used what we called the butterfly method. We multiplied these two numbers together and get 15 and write that up there. And then multiply these two numbers together. That's 8, and we write it up there. Then whichever one is bigger, that fraction is bigger. So since I got 15 here, then 3/4 is bigger than 2/5. Okay, so that was comparing fractions and decimals. Then we did ordering fractions and decimals, putting a list of them in order, sort of like what we were doing when we find the median of a set of numbers. The only difference is now that we know how to convert fractions into decimals, if you're going to order a list of fractions, I would first change to decimals, because putting decimal numbers in order is a lot easier than putting fractions in order, unless you're me and you screw up the answer sheets. But the thing you got to remember is you have to go back to fractions when you're writing your answer. You can't write the decimal numbers in as the answers because those were not the original problem. So you've got to make sure that you go back to the fractions. With decimals, I taught you how to make the grid. Okay, and so we line up place values and decimal point. Okay, and you saw me do that earlier today when I was drawing the columns. I needed to keep my numbers straight, and we were putting numbers in and keeping the numbers lined up so that we don't mess up and get the numbers, looking like a snake. Okay, so that was the fourth lesson that we did on decimals. Then we did converting fraction to decimal and decimal to fraction. When you are changing a fraction into a decimal, when you're changing a fraction into a decimal, say I have 3/5 and I want to change that into a decimal number. Then we take the number, if you're going to do it by hand, you take the number on the bottom and you divide it into the number on the top. And this one's fairly easy. So 5 does not go into 3, but we can put a decimal point and a 0. 5 will go into 36 times. So this is 0.6 if you're doing it by hand. If you're using a calculator, you punch the keys 3, then the divided by key, then the 5 key, and then the equal key, and it gives you the answer. If you are changing decimals into fractions, let's say that I have 0.36, then we learned that if we're changing that into a fraction, we know there's at least 10, 100, 1,000, etc. All the denominators are going to be 10, 100, 1,000, whatever. And then we look at how many decimal places there are. Since there are 2 decimal places, I need 2 zeros. And then we write that number on the top, 36, not 0.36, 36. And then if it will reduce, in this particular case, 36, you can divide 4 into 36, and you can divide 4 into 100. And 36 divided by 4 is 9. 100 divided by 4 is 25. So that was converting decimals into fractions and fractions into decimals. Then the next thing that we covered was some geometry. We talked about complementary angles. We talked about supplementary angles. We talked about vertical angles. We talked about, I'm going to come down here because I'm going to write up underneath here. We talked about adjacent angles. And then we talked about perimeter. So when we did the geometry unit just a few days ago, we covered those main topics. Complementary means 2 angles. It has to be 2. It cannot be 3. It cannot be 5. Only 2 angles that add to 90 degrees, like 30 degrees and 60 degrees. Those are complementary. Supplementary, 2 angles, has to be 2, not 3, not 5, not 6, 2 angles that add to 180 degrees. Remember I told you sup for super, and 180 is what we typically sometimes call the super angle. later on in geometry, we find out it's not, but at this point, we call it the superangle. So, for example, 120 degrees and 60 degrees add up to 180. Vertical angles are formed by lines that intersect, and those angles are across from each other. So this angle and this angle are vertical angles. They touch at the vertex point. This angle and this angle are vertical angles. They touch, but they're across from each other. Then, let's see. Then we did adjacent angles, and adjacent angles are angles that are next to each other. They're next to each other. Or we can say they share a side and vertex, no overlapping. Okay, so what that means is if I have an angle and then I put an angle next to it, this angle and this angle are adjacent. They share a common vertex and they share a common side. But if I had another situation, if I had, I can use that one. We actually have another situation here. You've got the great big angle, this big angle, and then these small angles. Well, the big angle is not adjacent to either of those small angles because the big angle has those angles inside of it. They overlap each other. So they're not next to each other. One's inside the other. You can't be next to something and inside of it at the same time. Then we did perimeter, and perimeter is the distance around a geometric shape. In other words, add the sides. Add up all of the sides. And it's basically as simple as that. Where you have to be careful is when you have those drawings where maybe one of the sides is missing. And what you have to do is kind of use like you would use with a house to be able to find those missing sides. Then the last thing we covered was some statistics, and we looked at mean, median, mode, and range. Mean is the average. And we calculate it by taking the sum of the data items. Okay, add up the data items and divide it by the number of data items. So if you have 10 numbers, you add those 10 numbers together and then you divide, I should probably write here, divide by the number of items in the set. So if you have 10 items, 10 data set points, you add those data points together and then you divide by 10 in that case to find the average. Then median means middle. And sometimes it's one number, sometimes it's two numbers. But if it's two numbers, you have to find the average. So if there's an odd number of data items, then you're going to have one median. If it's an even number of data points, you've got to take the two in the middle and find the average. Add them up, divide by 2. Then mode means most. Which data point is in the set the most? Sometimes there is no. Sometimes there is no mode. Sometimes the mode is several different numbers, but it's whatever appears the most. And then finally, the range is just the biggest number divided by, biggest number minus smaller number. So you look at your data set, which by the way reminds me, when we do median, I did not write, you have to put in order. If you don't put them in order, you can't find the middle. But once you put them in order, then that shall tell you what the biggest number is, what the smallest number is, and subtract. That's all it is. So that's the stuff we covered over the past few weeks.
If you liked this video, please click on the thumbs up. If you want to see more videos like this, please click on the subscribe button. And if you want to be notified when new videos are posted, please click the bell.